I'm Lloyd Holiday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. So what happened to that great standard of living that we used to enjoy here in America in the 1960s and even into the 1970s? Well, that's what the Cost of a Thing podcast is all about, and that's what I'm going to be talking about here. Okay, this is going to be part 2 of my podcast number 32, which was done on free money zones. And I forgot to put a chart that I made up into that original podcast number 32 on free money zones. So I'm going to do this podcast 33 on that particular chart and just emphasize this a little bit more. Okay, the first type of money listed on that chart is free money, as I talked about in podcast 32, and that is basically money that comes from asset bubbles, asset price bubbles. That is asset prices that are being inflated beyond their real value, way beyond their real value. And usually it's the government that is propping these asset values up above that real value. And that's what's going on right now in our country and in the world. And the other way where free money comes from is government. Also, again, the government's involved. Government borrowing and government money printing. And the Federal Reserve prints a lot of money, and the government borrows that money, and then they spend that in the economy. That's money. Now, neither one of these types of money was ever worked for. Nothing was done for it. No product was produced. It's just inflated asset values. And we see that all around us right now. This is going on in just about every large city in the country. Of course, some are worse than others. I talked about San Francisco area in podcast 32 as being one of the big free money zones, maybe the biggest in the United States today, maybe in the world. You can see on that chart there that another term I use to describe this free money is the rich man's dollar. This is the way a lot of the money that's accumulated by the very wealthy, top 10% and higher, comes to them this way through this asset price inflation scheme that the government is doing. So it's not this money is not worked for. It's just inflated to them, flows to them for free. Okay, the second type of money there on that chart is real money. And I'm going to call that the poor man's dollar, in honor of Loretta Lynn's song, The Coal Miner's Daughter, where she said her father worked in the coal mines to get a poor man's dollar. And so I'm gonna just call that a poor man's dollar. It's really a working man's dollar. It's a real dollar where something was produced or something was done, a service was given. That's where that dollar was derived from. And it didn't just come from nowhere. It came from, we get in there with our bodies and our hands and our minds, and we make things and we do things, and people pay us for that. And that's where these real dollars, the working man's dollar, the poor man's dollar, according to Loretta Lynn, comes from. So, as I explained in my podcast 32 on free money zones, in a free money zone like San Francisco, you got a lot of this free money flowing into that city, a lot of it. It behaves like counterfeit money. It floods the system in that city with that money. And then if you're working in that city for your poor man's dollar, it's competing with that rich man's dollar, the free money, for all the goods and services. There's only a certain amount of goods and services out there. And you have to compete with those free dollars, the rich man's dollars, that are flowing into that area. That's what lowers the working person's standard of living, because his dollar now doesn't buy as much because all that free money is there. I just want to emphasize that. That's what's going on here. That's why the standard of living is not so great. Of course, some cities are worse than others. San Francisco may be the worst one, as I said, at least in the United States. For value of your dollar working there, you're not going to get much for your money in San Francisco. Everything's expensive, especially, like I said, rent, housing, those kind of things. Very expensive there. So if you make only a regular salary, I can't imagine somebody trying to raise a family there unless there's some kind of executive or something like that, or a doctor, or maybe have a husband and wife, dual doctors might live there and be able to raise a family. But a regular guy making 40, 50, 60,000 a year, forget it. You're not going to be able to do anything in San Francisco. And let me just emphasize this once again. Most of this free money, it manifests itself in the costs of housing, cost of buying a house in these areas, and the cost of renting in these areas. That's where this free money is flooding in, and it's buying up this real estate, whether it comes from inflated stock prices, inflated housing bubble prices, whether it comes from foreigners. There's lots of foreign money coming in to those areas. And it might be coming out of housing bubbles in those foreign countries and then flows into the United States. Or if it comes from government money printing. Most of that is going to manifest itself into the cost of housing there. And that's why in these areas, that's the main symptom. When you see that, when you see super high housing prices, high rents, super high rents, I'm talking just extreme rent prices. And then the other symptom, like I said in podcast 32, is homelessness. When you see a lot of homelessness, and you see that in San Francisco, both of these things are super exaggerated in San Francisco. So that's how this free money drives up your rent costs, and therefore when you have to pay more for rent and housing, that leaves less disposable income for you to have a great standard of living. It's getting sucked into the rent, and you're not going to have a lot of money left to enjoy your life. They call that discretionary spending. You're not going to have a lot of discretionary spending because it's all mandatory spending. It's all to pay your rent. A lot of these people in these places, half their incomes or more goes toward rent now. And that goes completely against the old standard of your housing cost should be no more than 25% of your income to have a good standard of living and be able to save for your future. So what I did in life is I recognized that pretty early. I was probably in my early 30s when I realized what was going on with that. And I tried to move to cities where there wasn't a lot of those free rich man's dollars flowing in there, so that my money I would get more value for my money that I got from work and that I saved from work. And you can live a much better standard of living if you do that. You have to look around. You have to find a place that's like that, where there's not very many rich man's dollars flowing in there. Like I said, you don't want to be in the big trendy cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. You got to stay out of those areas. And even if you make more money there, it's not worth anything because it's going to get sucked up in rent, just vacuumed up by the rent monster or the housing price monster. You might make less money in a smaller town or outside the main city area like that, but it'll go a lot farther. Your rent might only be, a few $100s a month instead of a few $1,000s a month. So, you don't have to make as much money. And a lot of people in those big cities, in the free money zones, they're not making that much money. A lot of people are working minimum wage in those areas. And they must live at home with their parents. They live in roommate situations. I don't know. But you don't want to be in that situation. And if you find yourself in a large city like that, the best thing to do is try to live as cheaply as possible and save as much of that money as you can, and then take it out somewhere where you're going to get more value for your money to either buy a piece of land and build a house yourself on it. Buy a home that's already built. But save that money when you're in those areas and try to. But it's very hard because a lot of it gets vacuumed up by the costs of that city, and most of that is rent and home prices. And imagine this. Imagine how the world would be, how the United States would be, if there was no free money out there. All the asset prices priced at their real value. There was no government propping of those asset prices. The free market decided what those assets prices would be. The real wages of the workers and the other real money that was out in the system decided the price of those assets. Imagine that. Well, I'm going to talk about how that might be in my next video, podcast number 34. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. So, for myself, for a good standard of living, I stayed out of the free money zones, and I went to the real money zones and lived a lot better. It's one way you can still live a great standard of living in the United States here in 2020. Thank you for listening in today. And until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.